Move him to the kids' table. The food here is too expensive for a useless person. Tiffet pawed, when he screamed across the $1 million wedding. My mother nodded. My brother smirked with pure contempt. I calmly set down my coffee and whispered into my phone, "Invoke the morality clause. Freeze the 200 million. Now you're the ones with nothing." The scent of cedar wood and the rhythmic, persistent drumming of Seattle rain against the bay windows of my father's Bellevue study are the primary textures of my memory. In that house, the world was divided by a single heavy oak door. On one side, the air was thick with the scent of expensive catering, the exuberant noise of my brother Julian's constant celebrations, and my mother Eleanor's high society laughter that always sounded like breaking glass. On my side of the door, there was only the low hum of a computer cooling fan and the quiet, measured breathing of my father, Arthur Sterling. He was a man of cold logic and warm secrets, a man who saw early on that Julian had inherited my mother's thirst for the spotlight, but none of the grit required to keep the lights on. I was 12 years old when the foundation of my resentment and my eventual empire was laid. It was my birthday, a rare Saturday, when the Mariners were playing a home game at Safeco Field. My father had promised me it would be our day, just the two of us, away from the suffocating pretension of the Sterling social calendar. I had my baseball glove polished and sitting by the front door for 3 hours. But Julian had lost his favorite gold cufflinks, the ones Eleanor insisted he wear for a meaningless brunch with the Caldwells. My mother decreed that the entire household stay back to search. I sat on the porch in the damp Washington mist, watching the driveway, waiting for a car that never moved. They never came out. When they finally emerged, it wasn't to take me to the stadium. It was to take Julian to a consolation dinner at a 5-star steakhouse because he'd found the cufflinks in his own velvet drawer. I was told to stay home and focus on my studies because I was the responsible one. That night, my father didn't offer a hollow apology. Instead, he led me into his private sanctum and sat me down in front of an old IBM terminal that looked like a relic to anyone else, but felt like an altar to me. He reached into his desk and handed me a cheap black Casio F91W watch. The plastic strap felt flimsy compared to the gold Rolex Eleanor had bought for Julian's 10th birthday. "Julian got a Rolex today, Cal," my father whispered, his voice a mixture of gravel and honey, "but you get the time. Never build your house on another man's land. If you don't own the soil, you don't own the roof." He then showed me the first lines of what would eventually become the Ghost Protocol. It wasn't just code, it was a philosophy of existence. It was a way to be everywhere without ever being seen to be the invisible architecture upon which everyone else's reality rested. While Julian was being groomed to be the face of the Sterling heritage, the golden boy, who would grace the covers of local business magazines, I was being taught to be its heart, its lungs, and its hidden blades. We lived in the upscale suburbs of Bellevue, where perception was the only currency that mattered. My mother, Eleanor, operated our family like a high-stakes PR firm. She was a master of the narrative, constantly polishing Julian's image until he shone with a brilliance that was entirely hollow. I became the difficult one, the son who didn't fit the glossy brochures of the Sterling legacy. At Eleanor's lavish dinner parties, she would introduce Julian to venture capitalists and city officials with a beaming, practiced pride that never once turned in my direction. I was the ghost in the machine, the quiet technician who stayed up until 3 a.m. fixing the server crashes and database leaks so Julian wouldn't look incompetent during his 9 a.m. executive presentations. My father was the only one who saw the truth of the rot. He knew Apex Dynamics, the family firm, was becoming a hollow shell held together only by my silent labor and his fading influence. He spent those final years of his life ensuring I knew every backdoor, every encrypted vault, and every legal loophole within the company's foundation. He was preparing me for a war he knew I'd have to fight alone once he was gone. He taught me that silence wasn't a lack of power, but the ultimate concentration of it. When he passed the Bellevue estate felt colder, but my mission became crystal clear. Eleanor and Julian viewed his death as the moment they finally seized the throne. To them, I was merely a legacy coast a quiet, socially awkward technician they could keep tucked away in the basement like a piece of aging hardware. They didn't realize that Arthur Sterling hadn't left me a seat at their table because he had already given me the keys to the entire building. The foundation was laid in that rain-soaked study built on a silence they mistook for weakness, while I waited for the world to realize who was actually holding up the sky. When he passed, the house felt colder, but the mission became clearer. Eleanor and Julian saw his death as the moment they finally took full control. To them, I was just a legacy, cost a quiet technician they could keep in the basement. They didn't realize that Arthur Sterling hadn't left me a seat at their table because he had already given me the keys to the entire building. The foundation was laid in that rain-soaked study in Bellevue, built on the silence they mistook for weakness. By the time I entered the University of Washington in the heart of Seattle, my double life was no longer a childhood secret. It was a fully operational shadow state. To my professors in the Paul G. Allen Center, I was Caleb Sterling, talented but quiet student who sat in the back of the lecture halls blending into the gray Pacific Northwest mist. To the elite circles of Bellevue, I was the other Sterling, the one who didn't quite make the cut for the family's glossy Christmas cards. But in the late hours of the night within the windowless confines of a rented basement lab in the University District, I was the sole architect of SentryCore. While Julian was out at the high-end bars of Capitol Hill charging $500 bottles of small-batch bourbon to the Apex Dynamics corporate account, I was painstakingly writing the 4.3 million lines of code that would become the most sophisticated data management and security system in the modern industry. I didn't build it for Apex. I didn't build it to help Julian's visionary pitches. I built it for me. I structured SentryCore through a labyrinthine network of 15 different shell companies, each one a strategic node in a global web that even the most seasoned forensic accountants would struggle to untangle. These subsidiaries with clean anonymous names like Vortex Holdings and Vigilant Systems provided the third-party infrastructure that Apex Dynamics relied on to function. Julian thought he was a financial genius for outsourcing his back-end operations to save on overhead. He never realized he was outsourcing his entire company's soul to his younger brother's private servers. The true test of my underground empire came during the summer of my junior year. Apex Dynamics was hit by a massive state-sponsored cyber breach. $50 million in sensitive client data, financial records, private equity contracts, and proprietary trade secrets was on the verge of being leaked to the dark web. The office was in a state of absolute, unmitigated hysteria. I remember walking into the Apex headquarters in downtown Seattle and seeing Julian standing in the middle of the glass-walled bullpen. Sweat was soaking through his tailored Italian suit, and his hands were shaking as he screamed at a line of terrified IT professionals who had no answers. My mother, Eleanor, stood by the window, her face a mask of frozen terror as she calculated the impending PR disaster that would erase the Sterling name from the social registry. I didn't say a single word to them. I sat down in my corner cubicle, pushed aside a stack of Julian's discarded memos, and tapped a specific sequence into my Casio watch to unlock my encrypted laptop. I activated the Ghost protocol. Within 20 minutes of silent rhythmic typing, I had trapped the attackers in a digital dead-end-day honeypot I de-designed 2 years prior specifically for this kind of intrusion. I rerouted the malicious traffic and encrypted the stolen data before it could even leave the internal gateway. The breach was neutralized before the first news cycle could even catch wind of the vulnerability. The following morning, I watched the television in the break room. Julian was appearing on CNBC, looking into the lens with a practiced, teeth-baring charisma. He told the world how he had personally stayed up all night overseeing the elite defense of the company's infrastructure. He spoke about innovative leadership and technological resilience under his command. Eleanor stood just off camera, glowing with a maternal pride that felt like a physical weight in the room. She told every reporter from GeekWire and the Seattle Times that Julian was a once-in-a-generation talent, the true heir to Arthur Sterling's brilliance. I watched the broadcast while drinking a $5 cup of black coffee from a paper cup. I wasn't angry, I was clinically fascinated. It was a perfect case study in the Dunning-Kruger effect, a masterpiece of human arrogance. They were so blinded by the glare of the spotlight that they literally could not see the shadow that was holding them up. Julian was a puppet who thought he was the puppeteer, never noticing the strings of Sentry Core wrapped around his wrists. Over the next 3 years, Sentry Core became the invisible nervous system of Apex Dynamics. I integrated it so deeply into the company's DNA that pulling it out would be like trying to remove the oxygen from a room. Every transaction, every confidential employee file, and every high-stakes contract flowed through my proprietary algorithms. I knew the company better than the board of directors did. I knew Julian was embezzling funds to cover his mounting gambling debts at underground tables in Las Vegas. I knew Eleanor was using Apex charitable arm to buy herself a seat on the board of the Seattle Art Museum. I knew every lie they told the shareholders and every secret they kept from the SEC. I documented every single discrepancy, every theft, every moment of gross incompetence, and every ethical violation was logged, time-stamped, and backed up in the triple-encrypted Sentry Core vaults. I wasn't just building a software company. I was building a guillotine. I was the silent guardian of the Sterling legacy, the man who saved Apex from its own stupidity a dozen times overall, while Julian took the credit on magazine covers and Eleanor took the bows at charity galas. They viewed me as a utility, a quiet, low-cost tool they could keep in the basement. They had no idea that the tool had become the master, and that the basement was the only thing keeping their penthouse from crashing into the street. I was simply waiting for the right moment to stop being the ghost in the machine and start being the machine itself. The arrival of Tiffany was not a coincidence. It was a calculated maneuver that I smelled long before she ever stepped foot into the Sterling estate. She was a woman of sharp angles and polished glass, carrying an air of manufactured grace that Eleanor immediately fell in love with. To Julian, she was the ultimate accessory, a trophy from a powerful family that would finally cement his status as Seattle's tech royalty. But to me, Tiffany was a data anomaly. I didn't see a fiancé, I saw a Trojan horse. While the rest of the family was busy planning a $1 million engagement party at the Columbia Tower. I was sitting in my basement lab running a background check that went deeper than any standard security clearance. I didn't just look at her social media or her credit score. I looked at her digital footprint across the encrypted nodes of the dark web. It took me 3 nights of bypasses, but I finally cracked a series of hidden communications between Tiffany and the board of Blackwood Holdings Apex Dynamics' most aggressive competitor. Tiffany wasn't a socialite. She was a corporate saboteur. She had been planted by Blackwood to exploit Julian's vanity and Eleanor's desperation for a high society alliance. Her mission was simple: gain access to the Sterling family's intellectual property, specifically the Ghost Protocol they incorrectly believed Julian had authored. I watched, fascinated through the lens of my own hidden security cameras, as she sat in the Sterling living room sipping tea with Eleanor and subtly probing for information about the company's server architecture. It was like watching a predator move into a house full of blind sheep. But the true betrayal didn't come from Tiffany. It came from my own blood. 3 weeks before the wedding, I intercepted an encrypted email thread that was never meant for my eyes. It was a private exchange between Julian Eleanor and the family's longtime attorney. The subject line was chillingly clinical: resource optimization and IP consolidation. I felt a cold, familiar weight settle in my chest as I read the words. They weren't just planning a wedding, they were planning a funeral for my career. The disposal plan was laid out in terrifying detail. Julian had convinced Eleanor that I was a liability, a socially stunted technician whose presence at the company's higher levels would embarrass them during the upcoming IPO. They had drafted a series of legal maneuvers to be executed exactly 6 months after the wedding. Once the merger with Tiffany's family interest was finalized, and the public offering was complete, they intended to fire me, strip me of my remaining shares, and use a series of forged non-compete agreements to bar me from the tech industry for a decade. "Cal will be fine," Eleanor had written in one response. "He's always lived in the basement. We'll give him a small severance and he can disappear into his hobbies. Julian needs the spotlight to lead Apex to the next level. We can't have a ghost haunting the boardroom. Julian's reply was even sharper. Once I have his final signatures on the updated Sentry Corps licenses at the wedding brunch, we're done babysitting him. Has a 0. He's nobody without the sterling name. I sat in the dark, the blue light of my monitors reflecting off the cheap black plastic of my Casio watch. I didn't rage. I didn't break things. I felt a strange crystalline clarity. They thought they were the ones holding the scissors ready to cut the string. They had no idea I was the one who had woven the entire web. I began my counter-move with the precision of a surgeon. I didn't block their plan, I fed it. I allowed Julian to stumble upon a corrupted version of the Sentry Corps source codone that looked identical to the original but contained a morality clause hidden deep within the encrypted metadata of Appendix C. This clause was a legal landmine. It stated that the licensing rights for the software were contingent upon the ethical conduct of the leadership. If the leadership engaged in documented fraud, embezzlement, or bad faith contract manipulation, the license would immediately revoke, and the intellectual property would revert to the original architect. I also discovered that Julian had already begun forging my signature on several preliminary transfer documents. He was so arrogant, so sure of my passivity, that he didn't even try to hide the paper trail from the internal servers. He thought I'd never check the administrative logs. He was wrong. I recorded every keystroke, every unauthorized access point, and every forged digital signature. I compiled them into a truth vault, a massive encrypted dossier stored on a decentralized server that would trigger the moment I gave the command. As the wedding day approached, the atmosphere in the Bellevue estate became suffocatingly fake. Tiffany played the doting bride-to-be, Julian played the visionary CEO, and Eleanor played the proud matriarch. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance as if I were a piece of old furniture that didn't fit the new decor. They would talk over me at dinner, discuss their company's future, as if I weren't in the room, and laugh at Julian's genius in securing the upcoming $200 million Series C funding. I watched them, my heart a steady mechanical beat. I knew that the $200 million funding was predicated entirely on the continued stability of Sentry Corps, the very system I was about to pull out from under them. I knew that Blackwood Holdings was waiting in the wings, ready to swallow Apex the moment the Ghost Protocol was handed over by Tiffany. And I knew that my mother and brother were counting the days until they could legally erase me from existence. The paper trail was complete. The trap was set. They had built their entire empire on a foundation of my silence, never realizing that silence has a breaking point. I had spent my life as the invisible architect of their success, but as I prepared my suit for the wedding at the Rainier Club, I knew I was about to become the visible architect of their ruin. The 6-month clock they had set for my disposal was about to be reset to 0. They wanted to turn me into a ghost. They were about to find out that ghosts are the ones who truly own the house. The Rainier Club was a fortress of old-money Seattle, a place of dark mahogany, muffled silver, and the heavy scent of aged scotch. Under the grand chandeliers, the city's power brokers huddled in small, expensive circles, their laughter sounding like the clinking of coins. My brother, Julian Sterling, stood at the center of the ballroom. His chest puffed out in a tuxedo that cost more than my first 3 servers combined. Beside him, Tiffany was a vision in white lace and calculated grace, her eyes darting toward the representatives of Blackwood Holdings seated at table 4. They were the predators, and she was the Trojan horse waiting to deliver the kill. My mother, Eleanor, moved through the room like a queen mother, her hand resting on the shoulder of every donor senator and venture capitalist. When she finally reached me, her smile was a practiced mask that didn't quite reach her cold eyes. She leaned in her voice, a sharp, hushed whisper that carried the sting of 20 years of dismissal. "Caleb, we've had to reorganize the seating. Your name card has been moved. There's a small table near the kitchen doors, the kids' table. We needed the floor space for the Series C lead investors. Don't make a scene, dear. Just eat your salmon, stay out of the photos, and try to look like you belong in this family. even if you're just a ghost. I looked at her, seeing the years of erased birthdays and ignored achievements etched into her perfect makeup. The kids' table. I repeated the irony, tasting like ash. Move him now, Eleanor, Tiffany snapped, walking over with a glass of champagne in her hand. The food here is far too expensive for a useless person to be taking up a prime seat. He hasn't contributed a single dime to this IPO. He's lucky he's even in the building. Julian chuckled as he approached, adjusting his gold Rolex and turning his back on me to toast a billionaire from Medina. He's a ghost, Tiff. Ghosts don't need chairs. They just hover in the background while the real men do the work. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply turned and walked to the back of the room, past the grand piano and the velvet curtains, to the swinging double doors where the smell of industrial floor cleaner fought a losing battle against the aroma of seared fish. I sat in a cramped, rickety wooden chair intended for a 10-year-old. From this vantage point, the Golden Boy and his empire looked small, fragile, and utterly transparent. I pulled out my phone. The screen glowed with the master dashboard of Sentry Core. On the primary server, a green light pulsed, the heartbeat of Apex Dynamics. I could see the $200 million Series C funding sitting in a digital escrow waiting for the final signatures of the wedding brunch to be released. It was a mountain of gold built on a foundation of sand. Julian stepped up to the podium for the keynote toast. He raised his glass, the light catching the bubbles in his wine. To Apex Dynamics, he roared, his voice booming across the Rainier Club. To the future of the Ghost Protocol and the $200 million that will make the sterling name immortal in the halls of Silicon Valley. The room erupted in thunderous applause. The elite of Seattle stood, their glasses raised to a fraud. At that exact moment, I tapped the command line on my screen. I didn't type a manifesto. I didn't send an angry email. I simply entered 4 words that activated the dormant kill switch buried in the metadata of the licensing agreement: invoke the morality clause. The effect was not a bang, but a sudden, terrifying silence that rippled through the room like a cold front. Across the ballroom, phones began to vibrate in a frantic, dissonant chorus. The Medina billionaire's face went from flushed to ghostly pale as he looked at a high-priority alert on his Bloomberg terminal. The Series C lead investor, a man who prided himself on his iron nerves, dropped his crystal glass. It shattered against the parquet floor with a sound like a gunshot. "What the hell is this?" someone shouted from the front. "The transfer is blocked. The escrow is being clawed back. The IP licenses are showing as revoked for fraud and forgery." Julian froze mid-sip. He grabbed his tablet from the podium, his fingers trembling as he tried to log into the executive portal. The screen flashed red. Access denied. Credentials invalid. He looked at the massive monitors displaying the company's live valuation. The numbers weren't just dropping. They were being erased. $200 million in committed capital was vanishing in real time. Sentry Core, the very nervous system of Apex, had begun a hard shutdown sequence. Every computer in the Sterling office 5 blocks away was currently overwriting its own boot sector. I stood up from the kids' table. The heavy swinging doors of the kitchen were still moving behind me, a rhythmic thud that sounded like a ticking clock. I walked toward the head table, the room parting like the Red Sea. The silence was so thick you could hear the rain hitting the stained glass windows of the club. "Caleb," Eleanor's voice was a ragged edge of pure panic. She clutched at her pearls, her eyes wide with a realization she couldn't quite process. "Caleb, what did you do? Fix this right now." I stopped in front of Julian. He looked small. The tuxedo no longer fit his slumping shoulders. The Rolex on his wrist looked like a shackle. "I didn't do anything, Julian," I said, my voice calm, steady and carrying to the very back of the hall. "I just stopped lying for you. I stopped being the foundation you stepped on to reach the podium." You can't do this," Julian stammered, his eyes darting around the room at the investors who were already calling their lawyers. "It's my company. I'm the CEO. You're a tenant, Julian, and the lease just expired." I looked at Tiffany, whose face was a mask of calculated fury as she realized her Blackwood masters would never get the code they sent her to steal. She had gambled her reputation on a man who owned nothing but a name. I turned to my mother, who was trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "You told me to stay out of the photos, Mother. You told me the food was too expensive for a useless person." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a $5 bill, tossing it onto the table. For the salmon, it was a bit dry. I turned and walked out of the Rainier Club, the cheap plastic strap of my Casio watch the only thing I needed to keep time. Behind me, the Sterling Empire wasn't just falling, it was being deleted from existence. As I stepped out into the Seattle rain, I felt the weight of 20 years lift off my shoulders. The ghost had finally left the building, and he had taken the building with him. The morning after the wedding, the Seattle skyline was swallowed by a bruised purple fog, but the digital world was already a raging inferno. By 6:00 a.m., the first notification hit my encrypted tablet, a high-priority alert from TechCrunch. The headline was a desperate, jagged spear launched from the Sterling war room, Caleb Sterling, the disgruntled rogue developer embezzling millions from Apex Dynamics. Eleanor and Julian hadn't wasted a single second. They had hired a top-tier crisis PR firm out of San Francisco to craft a narrative of absolute betrayal. They painted me as a mentally unstable brother, a volatile, disgruntled employee who had hacked his own family out of pure, unadulterated spite. They flooded social media with grainy, unflattering photos of me in my basement lab, trying to turn my lifelong need for privacy into a sign of deviousness and clinical paranoia. Julian appeared on a rushed Bloomberg feed, his eyes bloodshot, and his tie loosened for dramatic effect, claiming that I had held the company's $200 million Series C funding hostage for a personal ransom. He looked like a victim, and for a few hours the internet's reactionary outrage machine believed him. I sat in my new office at the top of the Columbia Center, the highest point in the city, watching the storm break against the glass. I didn't call a lawyer to issue a cease and desist. I didn't post a frantic emotional rebuttal on X or Instagram. I didn't engage in the mudslinging. I simply opened the truth vault I had been curating since the day I realized my family was a predator. With a single biometric scan from my Casio watch, the heartbeat sensor I had customized years ago to serve as a hardware key, I released the dossier to the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times simultaneously. It wasn't an emotional rant. It was a clinical, digital execution. I provided the original source code timestamps from the University of Washington servers, proving beyond a shadow of a legal doubt that I was the sole author of SentryCore. I included the encrypted audio logs of Tiffany discussing the Blackwood Holdings bounty in our own living room. Most importantly, I uploaded the forensic evidence of Julian's forged signatures on the IP transfer documents, along with the bank records showing Eleanor's charitable diversions into offshore accounts. By noon, the tide didn't just turn, it became a tsunami that drowned the Sterling name. The TechCrunch article was retracted within the hour as the Truth Vault went viral across every tech forum and news aggregator. The Caleb Sterling hashtag wasn't about a rogue hacker anymore. It was about the silent architect who had finally stood up to corporate and familial tyranny. I watched the share count climb past 1.2 million in less than 3 hours. My phone, which I had set to Do Not Disturb, was a constant glow of incoming requests from investigative journalists and federal regulators. The real collapse, however, happened on live television. Julian, thinking he could still charm his way out of the wreckage with his practiced smile, agreed to a live interview with a senior tech analyst on CNBC. He was halfway through a lie about internal safeguards and his visionary oversight when the analyst cut him off with a look of pure stone. "Julian," the reporter said, her voice dropping into a lethal quiet tone that signaled the end. "We just received the authenticated logs from the SentryCore vault, verified by 3 independent cybersecurity firms. They show you accessing the system at 2:00 a.m. last Tuesday to forge your brother's digital ID for an unauthorized IP transfer. Do you have a comment on the federal fraud charges currently being drafted?" Julian's face didn't just go pale, it disintegrated. He looked off camera, his jaw working silently like a fish out of water. Then, forgetting the live microphone clipped to his lapel, he turned and hissed at Eleanor, who was standing in the shadows of the studio. "You told me the logs were wiped. You said the kid was too stupid to track the admin level. You promised me we were safe." The audio was crystal clear. It played on a loop across every news network for the next 6 hours. The sterling brand, which Eleanor had spent 30 years polishing into a mirror of perfection, shattered into a million jagged pieces. The S&P 500 watch list officially removed Apex Dynamics from its potential IPO category, citing systemic leadership fraud, criminal misconduct, and total loss of proprietary assets. The company's valuation, once soaring toward $1 billion, was now a crater. By sunset, the Seattle police and SEC investigators were seen entering the Apex headquarters with boxes for evidence. My mother's phone calls to me went from demanding to pleading to hysterical, leaving a trail of increasingly desperate voicemails. I blocked them all. I wasn't interested in the noise of the falling debris or the cries of the people who had tried to bury me. I was looking at the data. Apex stock wasn't just falling, it was being delisted. The empire was no longer a player in the market. It was a crime scene. I stood by the window as the office lights of downtown Seattle began to flicker on one by one, reflected in the Puget Sound. The media war was over. I had won not by shouting louder, but by being the only one holding the truth in a room full of liars. They had tried to drown me in a narrative of their own making, only to find that I owned the water, the pipes, and the very ground beneath their feet. The physical headquarters of Apex Dynamics did not explode, but the silence inside the glass tower felt like a vacuum. Within 72 hours of the Truth Vault being released, the Golden Boy's valuation had plummeted to exactly $0. Julian was no longer a CEO. He was a legal liability, a name whispered in boardrooms as a cautionary tale of hubris and digital fraud. My mother Eleanor found herself locked out of the very social circles she had spent 30 years curating. The sterling name, once a symbol of Seattle's elite, was now radioactive, and the creditors were circling the Bellevue estate like sharks in the Puget Sound. On the day the bankruptcy filing hit the federal courts in downtown Seattle, I walked into my father's old study one last time. The room smelled of the same cedar and old ink, but the air finally felt light. I sat at his heavy oak desk and pulled a small silver thumb drive from the hidden compartment I had built into my Casio watch. This was the final piece of the dead man's switch Arthur Sterling had described to me a decade ago, a secret he had kept even from his own wife. I plugged it into the terminal and was met with a prompt I had never seen before: biometric heartbeat and encryption key required. I pressed my thumb to the sensor and held my wrist against the desk, my pulse steady and calm, synced to the rhythm of a man who no longer had anything to hide. The screen flickered and a video file began to play. It was my father, filmed only weeks before he passed away. He looked tired, his face lined with the weight of the truth, but his eyes were sharp. "Cal," he said, his voice a ghost of the gravel and honey I remembered. "If you are watching this, it means the house of cards has finally fallen. I knew Eleanor and Julian would eventually try to bury you. I knew they would mistake your brilliance for a tool they could own and discard. I couldn't stop them while I was alive without destroying the family entirely, so I built you a backdoor to the future. I gave you the time, Cal. Now use it." The video cut to a legal memorandum that had been filed in a private trust in the Cayman Islands. It was a biometric trust, a secret estate plan that bypassed every public will Eleanor had manipulated. Because of Julian's documented fraud and Eleanor's complicity, a trigger clause had been activated. The real Sterling assets, the core patents, the offshore holdings, and the very land beneath the Apex Tower had never belonged to the corporation. They belonged to a private trust that only my specific heartbeat could unlock. My father had effectively turned Eleanor and Julian into tenants in their own lives, and I was now the landlord of their reality. "I didn't leave you a seat at their table, Cal," my father's image whispered before the screen went black. "Because you are the table." I didn't feel a rush of triumph or a need to gloat. I felt a profound, quiet weight of responsibility. I wasn't just the architect of a software system anymore. I was the guardian of a legacy they had tried to rot from within. I walked out of the Bellevue estate, leaving the keys on the marble counter. I didn't need that house. I'd already built my own fortress. The final act was the official unveiling of Vortex Tower. I stood on the balcony of the highest floor, overlooking the gray-shimmering expanse of Puget Sound. Below me, Seattle hummed with a new, honest energy. Sentry Core was no longer a shadow protocol. It was the gold standard for the global tech industry, protecting the data of millions. I held a simple paper cup of black coffee, the steam curling into the cool Washington air far away from the champagne and lies of the Rainier Club. Julian was gone, hiding from process servers in a rented apartment in a city that had already forgotten his face. Eleanor was a ghost in her own right, haunting the empty hallways of a legacy she had helped destroy with her own vanity. Oh, I looked out at the Space Needle rising through the mist like a sentinel. My father was right. Success wasn't about the noise you made or the Rolex on your wrist. It was about the soil beneath your feet and the clarity of the man standing on it. The Sterling era was over. The Vortex era had begun, and for the first time in my life, the silence wasn't a cage. It was absolute freedom.